So yeah, this past year hasn't been the greatest for China.
Right now to search up what's happening in China, how they're getting concentration camps, throwing innocent Muslims in there.
Comes from China.
An incredible speed force overload.
So it begs the question, how the hell did we get to here? Honestly, does anyone watching this know what China has been up to beyond this year? Because I'm going to be honest, I didn't even know what China's been up to. And I'm Chinese. And yes, I know this is supposed to be a FIFA series, but for you guys to fully understand what I'm going to be doing moving forward, I got to do like a quick all of Game of Thrones in 10 minutes type video right here, but with Chinese history. And I'm talking the not safe for work history, not the watered down shit that you got in history class. Because let me tell you, the history of China is fucking wild. And I'm gonna shamelessly beg right here for a like, because making this video, I'm like 90% sure that it's gonna get me banned from ever being able to go to China again. Or worse, this video might get demonetized. But without further ado, ladies and gentlemen, let me take you back to the very beginning, to the start of ancient China. Around 8,000 years before Christ was born, the Han Chinese would settle in the Fertile Valley. With a large labor pool and natural borders to protect them from invaders, China had a really dope starting spot as far as human civilizations go. Only issue is, the Yellow River would constantly flood and destroy crops and occasionally whole villages. It wasn't until one man in 2000 BC, who would later be called Yu the Engineer, finally figured out damming in ancient China and could control the flooding. A tremendous feat he was able to accomplish by apparently ignoring his wife and child for 13 years straight. And now I know who my dad modeled his life after. Love you, Dad. Wherever you are. Nah, I'm kidding. He loves me, I think. Anyway, for Yu's great efforts, he was named the first emperor of China. And yes, China's first emperor was a guy who ignored his family to build the dam. But anywho, China would go on to stay a form of dynastic rule for about the next 4,000 years. And a very important note about those 4,000 years was the majority of that time, China was number one. You see, back in the day, China used to be the shit. We were basically America. We had all the money, we had all the hottest shit like silk, cast iron, gunpowder. We basically had the off-white Jordan 1s, and the rest of the world had like Jesus sandals. Imagine Jesus in off-white Jordan 1s though. Pretty fire. So yeah, countless major wars were fought over trade routes to China. The greatest European powers were lining up to pay tribute just for the opportunity to buy their goods. To give you an example of how advanced the Chinese were compared to the rest of the world at the time, they developed the ability to liquefy iron and cast them into molds 1,000 years before Europe was able to replicate the process. That's like if you went back in time and gave a nation iPhones 1,000 years ago. Then you would understand how huge of an advantage that would have been for that country. Now imagine throwing that 1,000 years head start away. Those are Golden State Warrior levels of chokage. Yes, China got 3-1, and that double hurts because I'm Chinese and a Warriors fan. But it is an apt analogy. Because here was the issue. China thought that they were number one. Everyone else out there, a lost cause. Let's just close ourselves off. So that's exactly what they did. They closed themselves off to the world, both metaphorically and literally. They built the greatest wall of all time to keep out their version of Mexicans stuck in America. They believed that every other race was inferior to the Chinese, so their ideas couldn't be good. Thus, new technologies, sciences from other cultures were looked down upon and disregarded. And setting yet another historic footnote where racism really didn't work out well, so maybe we should stop doing it, people. To give you an example of how dismissive the Chinese were, when they were offered the newest military innovations in the 1920s by the English, they declined in Latin, because that was the language that all white people spoke to them. It didn't matter that Rome had fallen 1,000 years ago. To the Chinese, all white people were the same. They just didn't care. China had it too good for too long. They embraced isolationism, they were sniffing their own farts, and everything kind of worked out for them. Up until about 100 years ago. But this last 100 years of human history is what most people in the West are familiar with. A century of unprecedented growth, destruction, innovation, shifted power to a Eurocentric view that we are probably most familiar with today. And I'm sure if I asked you what has happened in America or Europe over the past 100 years, you could probably regurgitate a few facts from history class or two. But what if I asked you, what has China been up to for the past 100 years? Would you know? What would you say? Because the Chinese remember the past 100 years very vividly and by a specific name. The Chinese refer to it as the century of humiliation. So when we had last checked in on China, they had closed themselves off to the world, thinking that they were better than everyone. And when you close yourself off, you stop evolving. Other cultures catch up and eventually overpass you. Even when nations like Great Britain and America charged headfirst into the heart of the Industrial Revolution, China primarily stayed an agricultural nation. But interestingly enough, even without industrialization, they were still able to maintain the title as the largest economy in the world, even at the start of the 1900s. How were they able to do that? With sheer colossal manpower, as China's population at the time alone made up 40% of the world's total population at the time. So even while Europe had factories and production lines, China was kind of lulled into a false sense of security based on their manpower. As what the Chinese disregarded as barbarian trinkets and cute innovations would soon come back to bite them in the ass. And you gotta realize that multiple foreign powers have been looking to force China into trade for millennia. Now, by this time in history, Britain's tea habit was so voracious that they simply could not afford it any longer. But they found a clever loophole in that if you get a large population addicted to drugs, they will in fact trade you anything for addictive drugs. Wild concept, I know. So obviously, when China found out, they were like, hey, can you stop selling opium? And Britain was like, make me? And then they fought multiple wars, and Britain won them all for the right to keep selling highly addictive drugs to China. That is amazing. If you really think about it, that's like if you got addicted to meth and got sent to a rehab center, and your drug dealer broke into the rehab center and threatened to kill you unless you smoked more meth. Great Britain did this so that they could drink tea for cheaper. But I digress. Now, the loss of the Opium Wars were a devastating reality check to China. And to add insult to injury, Britain forced China to lease Hong Kong to them for 99 years. That would set off a chain of events that would lead to today's Hong Kong. Yeah, it turns out that giving a region democracy and free press for 99 years and then giving it back to a now totalitarian communist government, and you can understand why it isn't going smoothly. Back to China at the start of the 1900s. They were shell-shocked. You gotta remember, it was like 4,000 years of dominance. They were like the New England Patriots era of dominance. For as long as you can remember, they were number one. And to go from that and lose battle after battle after battle to foreign powers, it severely weakened the confidence in the emperor, eventually inciting instability. And then in 1911, a large-scale rebellion calling for reform dethroned the emperor and ended dynastic rule in China once and for all. This, unfortunately, had the side effect of plunging China into an era of civil war. China was fractured into many regions controlled by warlords during this time, but the two main factions that rose up during this period were the Communists and the Chinese Nationalist Party. Now, the Nationalist Party wanted China to be a democratic system, a la America. And the Communists, well, they wanted communism. And both of them pretty much fought tooth and nail for control over China. Only issue is this small thing started to happen called World War II. Yep, this really was an awful 100 years for China, because in 1937, Japan invaded, and they wiped the floor with them. The already battered and unorganized militias of China were no match for Japan's modern, well-disciplined army. Japan, unlike China, did decide to industrialize. Thus, it allowed a smaller nation with less resources to produce planes, battleships, and modern weaponry. All the while, China was still relying on steam power and raw manpower. This would cost China catastrophically, with China suffering frightening numbers of casualties, numbering second overall of any country during World War II. And the Japanese were not just efficient killers, they were exceptionally cruel. The brutality of the Japanese invasion would culminate in one of the darkest atrocities in World War II. A war that has had some notable atrocities. But this event became so heinous that some in Japan to this day denied it ever happened. And that, of course, is the Grape of Nanking. I'm calling it the grape, not to minimalize it, just I don't want to get demonetized. The actions of the Japanese soldiers during the invasion of Nanking were so inhumane that the Nazi ambassador had to speak out about it. Do you understand the levels of horrific shit that a Nazi has to witness to be like, whoa, 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 guys, I'm a Nazi, but this is too far. And that man today is still celebrated as a hero in China. Yes, a Nazi is a historic hero in China. The world is a weird place. Now, beyond the baby murder and the mass sexual assaulting of women, other notable events of the Grape of Nanking included 2 Japanese generals in charge had a contest to see who could chop off 100 Chinese prisoners' heads faster, then published the results in a Japanese newspaper like it was fantasy football. This traumatic event would scar China forever. It is seen as their Auschwitz, and it would be a catalyst to drive the nation to immediately industrialize, so something like this could never happen to them again. So out of necessity, the Communist Party and the Nationalists joined forces to fight the Japanese. Only issue was, the Communist Party were clearly the more effective, and thus became more popular with the people. So when the Japanese were finally defeated, civil war resumed quite quickly afterwards, with the Communists driving the Nationalists to retreat to a certain island. Anyone recognize this island? They officially named it the Republic of China, but you might have heard of it. It's called Taiwan. And now you know why. It's complicated. So, World War II is over, and the Communists have won China. Now they got to appoint their new leader, and turned one of the most controversial figures in human history that you probably didn't learn enough about. Chairman Mao was a great war hero, but in the beginning, he grew up in rural China. Said to be a good student, he moved to attend modern schools where he was inspired by Western ideals and especially intrigued by the writings of Karl Marx. Oh no! It was at this young age that he would adopt the ends justify the means philosophy, which would become a little bit problematic later on. He was one of the prominent leaders of the communist forces against the nationalists and Japanese, and apparently was incredibly charismatic, winning over many young people to his side with his speeches. And you could very much think of him as World War II's Trump, if Trump had actually fought in a war. But when there was no one left to fight, Mao had to lead. And at first, TBH, it wasn't that bad. He took away lands from the warlords and gave it back to the peasants to farm. He greatly improved healthcare as well as women's rights. He doubled the amount of schools, which increased literacy in China, and he fought to greatly decrease opium addiction. Communism was looking pretty in China. It was looking so pretty that he started this thing called the 100 Flowers Campaign, where he opened himself up to constructive criticism to better serve China. What he got was essay after essay of Chinese intellectuals just tearing his ass up with diss track levels of disrespect. Mao quickly rebutted these arguments by labeling his haters enemies of the state and imprisoning them, or making them disappear altogether, starting a long-holding pattern of imprisoning and publicly humiliating people who spoke out against the Communist Party. Another side effect of these criticisms was it made Mao paranoid about losing power. But he had another major problem. Productivity under communism was leveling out. Since everyone was being compensated the same, no one ever really tried to be exceptional. In fact, workers were terrified of outshining their co-workers, because if they did, the rest of their workers would either shun them or actually get violent at times. Thus, Mao issued a series of disastrous reforms that he would call the Great Leap Forward, which can be summed up with this. Yes, Mao's Great Leap Forward looked to hyper-increase production in China by essentially telling peasant farmers to work harder to produce more food to export. But mismanagement and constant fear of losing office, as well as being publicly humiliated or even being murdered, basically led to the mass underreporting of numbers of food produced. And China just happened to be so lucky that this all coincided with one of the worst droughts and famine China had ever seen. But China was still exporting their food stores to countries during this time, which left no food for the peasant workers. This would lead to the estimated deaths of 40 million Chinese through starvation. 40 fucking million people died in China from starvation. This is less than 100 years ago, making it the deadliest famine in human history. More people died in China from famine during the Great Leap Forward than had died in all of World War I combined. This level of starvation was what motivated my grandparents to immigrate to America, just like something else that immigrated to America. What best encapsulates the ineptitude of the Great Leap Forward was Mao had the brilliant idea of taking farmers and asking them to make steel in their backyards. With no experience, he just encouraged people to make steel. That's like if Trump was like, I'm bringing steel back, baby. It's gonna be huge. Just everyone go into your backyard and make some. If he said that, Americans right now would have the same amount of experience as the Chinese did when they actually tried this. Thousands of Chinese attempted to make steel for the first time in their backyards because the rewards were so handsome for this. And not only did it result in drawing away thousands of talented farmers from producing food during a famine, the vast majority of the steel produced was unusable. Because when people make steel in their backyards with zero experience, it turns out they make dog shit steel. Who would have known? Once again, a reminder that China had cast iron 1,000 years ahead of Europe. We went from that to making amateur steel in our backyards. We are the Leeds United of world history. And if that wasn't enough, Mao came up with another sweeping reform called the Cultural Revolution. Basically, Mao felt old was bad and getting in the way of his idealized communist future that he had for China. And education that didn't serve the country's ideology was dangerous. So thus, old culture, old ideology, old customs, old traditions, and old vestiges of Imperial China were all to be torn down and lost to history, as basically Mao rewrote it to best flatter communism and himself. He would accomplish this by burning historical texts, destroying national treasures and landmarks, publicly humiliating scholars and intellectuals, and sending them into forced labor camps to be re-educated. How the hell did he not get overthrown? And not only that, he's still revered by some in China to this day. And the best way to think of it was China back then was kind of like North Korea is today, but bigger. Dirt poor, plenty of starvation, and copious amounts of propaganda to worship your authoritarian leader as a demigod. Where do you think North Korea got the playbook from, baby? Communist China in the 60s even made every citizen own and recite Mao's Little Red Book. A book essentially of Mao's most popular communist propaganda teachings. Young people were indoctrinated, and children were conscripted into the Red Guard, a young paramilitary group where they were encouraged to root out suspected dissenters of communism throughout China, which usually just led to children giving up their teachers and even sometimes their parents. All of this was in the name of Mao's ideology. And what did China have to show for all of this sacrifice? Did the ends justify the means? No! They had nothing! They had pretty much nothing to show out of all of this. China tried to achieve communism through a famine, destroyed its connection with its history, and effectively threw away a generation of its smartest people. By the time of Mao's death in 1976, China was effectively a third world shithole, which makes it even more impressive because over the next 30 years, they would become the second largest economic superpower in the world. So how was China able to rise like a phoenix from the ashes with the greatest economic comeback in world history? Enter in the main character of the moment and current president of China, Xi Jinping. Xi Jinping grew up a Red Prince, which basically meant his father was a high-ranking Chinese official in the Communist Party. Early in his life, he lived a life of luxury. While millions starved in the countryside, he was living in the Forbidden City, which is the ex-palace of the Chinese emperor. But when Mao's Cultural Revolution went down, his father was ousted from power, publicly humiliated. Xi went from living the fuckboy life to being sent to a farm labor camp. A labor camp where he had to shovel pig shit and clean toilets until Mao Zedong's death. Yes, arguably the most powerful man in the world right now was a literal pig shit farmer at one point. Started from the bottom, now we here. After Mao Zedong died, many of the Red Princes were actually restored to power and were allowed to rejoin the Communist Party in elevated positions. And this is interesting because this is where Xi separates himself from other Red Princes as well as other world leaders, because instead of using his father's political status to gain higher office, he instead opted to start at the bottom. He completely removed his father's name from his application and took a job that no one wanted in an outpost in bumfuck rural China. But he would not stay there long, as he quickly rose through the ranks, developing a reputation as a hyper-efficient bureaucrat and ruthless pragmatist. When he became president of China, he was seen as the right choice because the party leaders thought that he would be easier to control. But Xi had other ideas. Now, he endeared himself to the Chinese people by enacting sweeping reforms to weed out corruption in China. Side note, corruption has probably been the biggest single political issue in China for thousands of years. Just culturally, it is known simply if you have enough money or the right connections, you could get anything done in China. And it has been a colossal issue with Chinese politics as well as ruling China for millennia. Xi Jinping made over 1.5 million arrests as a part of a corruption crackdown of officials taking bribes and accepting favors. Which sounds amazing, but he also kinda used a portion of these arrests to purge political rivals from the Communist Party and consolidate power for himself. That would be like if Trump cracked down on the opioid crisis in America by also removing every Democrat and disloyal Republican in office. But the Chinese people were willing to overlook that, because you gotta remember, after Mao's disastrous reforms, China was like, communism economics not really working out. Let's try something new. So they gradually shifted away from communist economics to private ownership, aka China got capitalistic as fuck, boy. And when they made the switch, the GDP of China began growing by 10% every year for over 30 years. So it was already going good before Xi Jinping got into office, but during Xi Jinping's reign as president of China, he has lifted 800 million people out of poverty and took China to the second largest economy in the world, only to the US. And the people of China loved Xi for it. Don't believe me? This is a fan-made social media video that went viral addressing President Xi Jinping as Big Daddy Xi. I'm not making this up. This is real. China is amazing. They love being lifted out of poverty so much that they were willing to overlook mass censorship of the media. They have gladly allowed mass surveillance of camera equipment and facial recognition technology to percolate their major cities. And China still holds the Mao tradition that speaking out against the government can result in public humiliation via TV broadcasts where basically you have to apologize profusely and cry on camera in front of the nation. Or still, sometimes you just disappear. It's an issue that happens in China. You just disappear. But from the perspective of the Chinese people, you would take that deal in a heartbeat. Going from dying of starvation to middle class in a single lifetime, hell yeah, you could block Google. China was pissed off, poor, and hungry. So when Xi brought an unprecedented age of prosperity, they didn't care that he removed term limits from his presidency, effectively making him the new emperor of China. They were happy to finally be out of the century of humiliation. And as Europe squabbled and had a recession, and America distracted itself with a political circus, China was quietly on their way to reclaiming what they see as their rightful place as the dominant superpower of the world. And if you were like, oh yeah, so what? So what if they become the biggest economy in the world? How is that going to affect me? Well, the scary thing is, you've already seen the effects over the past year. You might remember when NBA players and teams had to go ahead and kowtow to China because the GM of the Rockets showed support for Hong Kong during the protests. Arguably the biggest athlete in the world, LeBron James, was on national TV sucking the dick of China. It was like, oh, I love China and the Chinese people. And do you remember the other incident when Blizzard suspended 2 Hearthstone broadcasters and banned a player for speaking out about Hong Kong during a live stream? Do you understand that this was China using soft power to effectively take away Americans' right to free speech? And it's not like they did this. They were able to do it. They were able to silence dissent in a foreign country. In America, it's not unlike back in ancient China when the foreigners were made to kiss the ring of the emperor if they wanted to do business in their lands. And now China have their hands in a lot of shit that you probably play or know of. League of Legends, they own that. 40% of Fortnite, that's them. And what's the biggest app that has exploded over this past year? TikTok, guess who owns that? All Chinese companies, all of them have connections to the Chinese government. We live in a new age of colonization, but battles aren't won with guns or armies anymore. That shit's over. The weapon of dominance today is data and economic might. And China is the nerd who got picked on in school and then went on to invent Google, and he is pissed off about it. They are capitalism without a conscience, and that ruthless pragmatism has made them a near unstoppable juggernaut. And with no term limits on Xi Jinping, it looked like he would be able to guide China for decades to come. But then something funny happened at the end of 2019. You might have heard of it. China is a one-party system that took its population from starvation to economic superpower at unprecedented speed. With single-party control, this virus has laid bare the drawbacks to that style of government. When the first outbreak of Wuhan occurred, the Chinese government covered it up, saying that there was no evidence of human-to-human contact. The original whistleblower was accused by local government of making false claims on the internet, his name was Li Wenliang, and he was made to denounce everything after he tried to warn the Chinese people and the world that there was a new virus that was killing people and was highly transmissible. Dr. Li would die shortly after from complications from the virus. He would later be vindicated by the Chinese government, offering up a rare apology to Dr. Li Wenliang after the Rona problem became too big to cover up. His death and the initial cover-up of Big Rona would spark a massive outrage across Chinese social media. And now, because of China's failure to act quickly in containing the virus, they are responsible for the biggest economic and humanitarian disaster since World War II. The Chinese people are very upset, and distrust for the Communist Party and Big Daddy Xi are at an all-time high. Deaths in China recently are said to have leveled out, if you believe what China is saying. The official numbers out of China say that there have actually been less than 5,000 deaths total, but there are reports coming out of China that the urns that are ordered to house the remains of the cremated dead are actually in the numbers of 50,000, which would bring their death totals much closer to what America is experiencing right now. So unless China has found a vaccine out of their asshole, the numbers are not adding up. Unfortunately, though, only the Chinese Communist Party know what the true number is. Some are saying this could be the end of Xi Jinping's regime, and there have actually even been violent protests that have broke out in the Hubei province. Even with China's massive army of censors, people have been taking to social media like never before. Xi is doing his best to scrub the internet of all the evidence of the initial cover-up, and the CCP have officially blamed the local officials and police in Wuhan as the sole bad actors, and totally acted independently of the wishes of the Communist Party. And that is pretty much all of China's history up until now. Obviously, still a lot of questions to be answered. What happens to Xi, with China, with the future of the world's economy? So much is on the line right now, so the next few months will be crucial to see if China can somehow come out of this, or will they crumble back into another century of humiliation. And with all that as a backdrop, the China ruined everything career mode 2020 edition is set to begin. This will be very different from any other career mode you will ever see in your lifetime, because as China goes, this career mode will go. Every week, I'm going to report on what's going on in China, and whatever happens there will have an effect in real time with the career mode. And on that note, tune in next week to find out what that actually translates to. Welcome back, everyone. It's time to return to China.